Thank God, this incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend starting now, the Nexus Military Academy floating serenely above Kepler-7's third moon was, by all galactic standards, a monument to civilized warfare which, if you think about it, for more than 2 seconds, is about as contradictory as a vegetarian butcher shop. But nobody seemed particularly bothered by this philosophical hiccup. The station's gleaming corridors house the galaxy's finest military minds from 47 different species, all learning the delicate art of organized violence with a kind of academic rigor usually reserved for particle physics or professional wine tasting. The Academy prided itself on accepting only the most evolved, sophisticated species, those who had transcended their primitive urges and approached conflict with calculated precision. Humans naturally had been excluded from this club for the obvious reason that they still solve problems by hitting things until they stop moving, or at least that had been the prevailing wisdom until the Terran integration protocol forced everyone's hand, apparently after humans had accidentally prevented 3 separate galactic wars through what diplomats euphemistically called aggressive negotiation tactics. The Galactic Music Council decided maybe these knuckle-draggers deserved a seat at the big kids' table. The Academy's administrators had approached human integration with all the enthusiasm, music of a root canal patient, creating a special experimental program that sounded progressive on paper, but translated roughly to let's see how badly this goes. They'd accepted exactly 12 human cadets, carefully selected music for their exceptional restraint and diplomatic potential. The selection committee had clearly never met an actual human. And GT music. And GT, because restraint and humans go together like matter and antimatter, spectacular when they interact, but usually not in ways anyone planned. Marcus Kowalski was specimen number 7 in this grand experiment, though he preferred Tank to Marcus, which should have been the first red flag for anyone paying attention. Tank stood 64 in his standard issue Academy uniform, built like someone had decided to see what happened when you crossed a freight train with a philosophy major. His personnel file listed his previous occupation as construction foreman and his hobbies as reading military history and recreational combat sports, which was Academy speak music for this man. Enjoys hitting things professionally and for fun. The irony, lost on most of the faculty, was that Tank represented exactly the kind of restrained human they'd been looking for. He'd served 8 years in the Terran Marines before discovering that civilian life involved significantly less explosions and considerably more paperwork, leading him to construction work where he could at least demolish things legally. And GT music. And GT. He read Clausewitz for fun, spoke 3 alien languages fluently, and hadn't started a fight in over 2 years by human standards. And GT music. And GT. He was practically a pacifist monk. His classmates, however, saw only what their cultural programming told them to see. Barely evolved primate who probably counted on his fingers and solved complex equations by punching calculators. The Saurian cadet Velta epitomized this attitude, treating Tank's presence like a personal insult to his species' superiority. Velta came from a warrior culture that had spent the last millennium perfecting the art of looking down on everyone else, which was impressive considering Saurians were literally cold-blooded. His scales gleamed with a kind of polish that screamed aristocracy, and his bearing suggested he'd been personally offended by evolution for producing anything as crude as mammals. The crystalline being known as Kixnar represented the mind of an collective, a species that communicated through harmonic resonance and considered violence a form of mental illness. And GT, music. And GT, they regarded Tank with a kind of clinical fascination, usually reserved for particularly interesting bacteria. Music samples, Zephlock the insectoid, representative from the hive worlds. And GT, music. And GT possessed 4 arms and an exoskeleton that made him look like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a philosophy professor. He spoke in clicks and whistles that the translation matrix rendered into the most pretentious academic jargon imaginable. Combat theory class met every Tuesday at 800 hours in Lecture Hall 7, an amphitheater designed to accommodate the various physiological requirements of 47 different species. Professor Hicksmith, a gastropod whose species had evolved past the music need for violence sometime around humanity's Bronze Age, conducted these sessions with a detached air of someone explaining arithmetic to children. His lectures covered the theoretical applications of force in conflict resolution with all the passion of an accountant discussing tax law. On this particular Tuesday, the topic was primitive combat methodologies and their evolutionary obsolescence, which was basically an hour-long explanation of why hitting people was for species too stupid music to figure out better alternatives. Tank sat in his usual spot, back row, aisle seat, positioned for maximum situational awareness, while Professor Hicksmith droned on about the crude inefficiency of physical confrontation, the application of kinetic force against biological targets. The professor explained, his translator rendering his mucus-based speech into properly academic tones represents the most primitive form of conflict resolution. Advanced species have long since evolved past such barbaric necessities, developing sophisticated methodologies that render physical violence obsolete. Velta's scaled head turned toward Tank with predatory interest. Indeed, Professor, it's fascinating how some species still cling to such primitive instincts. One might wonder if certain members of our Academy truly belong among civilized beings. The comment hung in the artificially recycled air like a bad smell. Tank continued taking notes, his stylus moving across his tablet with the kind of focused attention that lesser beings might mistake for obliviousness. Music. In reality, he was conducting a detailed tactical assessment of the room's exit points, music sightlines, and potential improvised weapons, because old habits die hard and Marines never really retire. An astute observation. Music. Cadet Velta, Professor Hicksmith continued, apparently immune to subtext. The reliance on physical force indicates an underdeveloped capacity for strategic thinking. Advanced warfare requires intellectual sophistication that transcends mere brute force applications. Kixnar's crystalline form chimed softly, the sound translating as smugly Academic, the primitive brain structure lacks the neural complexity required for true strategic thinking. Physical violence becomes a default response when higher cognitive functions. Music prove insufficient. Tank stylus paused for exactly 0.3 seconds, not long enough for anyone to notice unless they were specifically watching for micro-expressions which nobody was. He resumed note-taking, occasionally nodding as if deeply engaged. Music, with the professor's wisdom about his species' fundamental stupidity. Zeflock's mandibles clicked in what music passed for laughter among his kind. The human integration program represents an interesting anthropological study. We observe music primitive behavioral patterns in their natural academic habitat. Quite educational, Velter agreed, his voice carrying music, the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to apex predators, though one wonders about the wisdom of exposing such specimens to advanced military theory, rather like teaching quantum physics to a particularly clever ape. The other students found this hilarious, their various forms of laughter creating a symphony of condescension that would have impressed Satan himself. Tank continued writing, his hands steady as a surgeon's, while internally cataloging every insult for future reference. Terran Marines had taught him many valuable skills, but the most important was patience, the ability to absorb unlimited amounts of abuse while planning exactly how to distribute it. Back with interest, Professor Hicksmith, riding a wave of classroom engagement, decided to elaborate on his theme. Human military history provides numerous examples of this primitive approach. Their conflicts demonstrate a consistent pattern of applying maximum force with minimal strategic consideration. The ancient human general Sun Tzu wrote extensively about warfare, yet his own species consistently ignored his teachings in favor of direct confrontation. Tank's pen stopped moving entirely. Anyone familiar with human expressions might have noticed a subtle tightening around his eyes, but his classmates were too busy enjoying their intellectual superiority to pay attention to mere mammalian body language. Sun Tzu advocated winning without fighting, Tank said quietly, his voice cutting through the ambient, chuckling like a blade through silk. He believed the supreme excellence consisted of breaking music, the enemy's resistance without fighting. The lecture hall fell silent with the kind of shocked quiet usually reserved for someone accidentally triggering fire alarm during a funeral. Professor Hicksmith blinked his compound eyes in surprise. He'd apparently forgotten humans could actually speak. Yes. Well, the professor stammered. And GT, music. And GT, theoretical understanding doesn't necessarily translate to practical application. Human history demonstrates a consistent failure to implement such sophisticated concepts. Velta leaned forward. And GT, music. And GT, sensing an opportunity to press his advantage, knowing theory and possessing the intellectual capacity. Music, to apply it, represent entirely different capabilities. A parrot can repeat words without understanding their meaning. Tank's response was a slight nod, as if conceding the point. You're absolutely music right. There's definitely a difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The Saurian's eyes gleamed with triumph. He'd successfully put the primitive his place through superior reasoning and cultural sophistication, drunk on his rhetorical victory, Velta decided to cement his dominance with a physical demonstration of the social hierarchy. He extended his leg under the desk and delivered a sharp kick to Tank's shin, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to establish dominance in the way that bullies had been doing since the dawn of consciousness. Tank's reaction was immediate and educational. He looked down at his shin, then up at Velta with the kind of mild curiosity usually reserved for interesting weather. Patterns, did you just kick me? Velta's scaled lips curved into what passed for a smack among his species. I was demonstrating the application of kinetic force against biological targets. Quite primitive, wouldn't you agree? Tank nodded thoughtfully, music as if considering this philosophical point. You know what? You're absolutely right. Physical violence is pretty primitive. He stood up with a fluid grace of someone whose body had been professionally trained to become a weapon. And GT, music. And GT, his movements so casual that nobody initially recognized them as threatening. Tank's 6FD frame music unfolded like a collapsible sea engine, and for the first time the other students got a clear look at exactly what 2 years of construction work had done to an already formidable military physique. In fact, Tank continued conversationally, I'd say kicking someone under a desk ranks pretty high on the primitive behavior scale, right up their music with I don't know, territorial displays and dominance rituals. Velta's predatory confidence flickered as some deep-buried survival instinct finally kicked in. Turns out evolution had programmed even the most arrogant species to recognize when they'd awaken something that really should have been left sleeping. Now, Tank said, rolling his shoulders in a way that made his uniform stretch across muscles that definitely hadn't come from academic study. Professor Hicksmolt was just explaining how advanced species have evolved past the need for physical violence, which makes me curious, what does that say about someone who kicks people under desks? The lecture hall had achieved the music kind of silence usually associated with deep space or the moment before natural disasters. Professor Hicksmolt's gastropod form had gone rigid with a distinctive tension of someone watching a runaway freight train approach a crowded intersection. Perhaps, Tank continued, and GT, music, and GT, his tone remaining conversational, despite the fact that he was now clearly stalking around the desk toward Velta. We should explore the practical applications of primitive combat methodologies, for educational purposes. Velta's warrior instincts finally overcame his cultural arrogance, and he lunged forward with the kind of aggressive movement that had made his species apex predators on their home world. Unfortunately for him, Saurian combat techniques had evolved for fighting other Saurians in their natural environment, not for engaging former Terran Marines in the confined space of an academic lecture hall. Tank sidestepped the charge with minimal effort, grabbed Velta's extended arm, and used the Saurian's own momentum to introduce him to the fundamental principles of applied physics. Specifically, he demonstrated how leverage, rotational force, and gravity could combine to send a 200 lb reptile crashing into the floor with enough force to crack the reinforced composite decking. The sound of Velta's spine Impacting the deck echoed through the lecture hall like a gunshot, followed immediately by the distinctive wheeze of someone having their respiratory system forcibly reset. And GT, music. And GT, Tank stepped back, brushing imaginary dust off his hands with a satisfied air of someone who just solved a particularly music challenging equation. See, he said to the stunned classroom, primitive but effective. Kixnara's crystalline form began vibrating with harmonic frequencies that translated as panic-induced incoherence. And GT, music. And GT, the minor van collective's representative, had apparently never witnessed actual violence and was experiencing something approaching system overload. Their carefully structured worldview, built around the assumption that physical conflict was a theoretical concept, was crumbling like a house of cards. Music in a hurricane, Zeflock being an insected with 4 arms and a chitinous exoskeleton, apparently decided he had better odds than his fallen classmate. His species had evolved from pack hunters, and pack hunters don't back down from challenges, even when music basic pattern recognition should suggest they really should. Insectoid launched himself forward with all 4 arms extended, mandibles clicking in aggressive harmonics. Tank watched him approach music with the patient interest of a professor observing a student attempt a particularly difficult music problem. At the last second, he ducked under Zeflock's uppermost arms, grabbed 2 of the lower ones, and introduced the insectoid to another fundamental principle of human combat. Sometimes the best technique is the simplest one. Tank executed a textbook hip toss that would have made his old drill instructor proud, sending Zeflock tumbling through the air in a graceful arc that terminated when the insecto exoskeleton met the lecture hall's wall. With a sound like breaking pottery, Zeflock slid down the wall and came to rest in a twitching heap, his 4 arms moving randomly as his nervous system tried to process what had just happened. Classical leverage application, Tank explained to the increasingly horrified audience. Humans have been using variants of this technique for approximately 4,000 years. Primitive music, yes, but time-tested. Kixnara, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, began backing away with the kind of urgent retreat usually associated with escaping natural disasters. Unfortunately, their crystalline form wasn't designed for rapid movement, and they managed about 3 steps before Tank closed the distance with the casual efficiency of someone who'd spent years chasing down fleeing combatants. Now, the minor van collective believes violence is a form of mental illness. And GT, music. And GT, Tank said, his tone remaining conversational as he approached the trembling crystal being, which raises an interesting philosophical question. If I'm mentally ill, does that make this medical emergency or teaching moment? He reached out and flicked Kixnara's crystalline surface with music, 1 finger, not hard enough to cause damage, but sufficient to demonstrate that their vaunted harmonic defenses were about as effective as tissue paper against a flamethrower. The being's resonant frequencies shifted into what could only be described as crystalline music. Sobbing pleas, Kixnara's translator managed between harmonic hiccups. We meant no offense, our comments were purely academic in nature. Tank nodded understandingly. Academic. Music. Right, like kicking someone under a desk. Professor Hicksmold had apparently found his voice, though it emerged. Music as a high-pitched whistle that the translator rendered as barely coherent panic. Cadet Kowalski, this behavior is completely unacceptable. Violence has no place in an academic environment. Tank turned toward the professor with the kind of polite attention usually reserved for helpful music, but misguided advice. With respect, Professor, I was just providing a practical demonstration of the theoretical concepts you were discussing. Music. You said physical violence was primitive and ineffective. I was merely testing that hypothesis. This is assault, the professor squeaked. Security will be notified immediately. Actually, Tank said, settling back into his seat with the calm satisfaction of someone who just completed a successful experiment. This is self-defense, Cadet. Velta initiated physical contact. I simply responded using appropriate force to neutralize the threat. He gestured toward the three aliens in various states of distress. As for effectiveness, well, I'd say the results speak for themselves. Music. 3 opponents neutralized in under 30 seconds using techniques that are, according to your lecture, primitive and obsolete. The lecture hall doors burst open as Academy security forces arrived, their weapons drawn and ready for action. Security team consisted of 6 heavily armed Zentorians whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a rhino and a particularly aggressive accountant. They swept into the room expecting to find a chaotic brawl and music, instead discovered one human sitting calmly at his desk, while 3 other cadets lay groaning on the floor. The lead security officer, a grizzled veteran named Commander Thexmal, surveyed the scene with the experienced eye of someone who'd spent decades dealing with Academy incidents. His gaze moved from the downed students to Tank, who was helpfully organizing his notes while waiting for the situation to resolve itself. Cadet Kowalski. Commander Music, Thexmal said, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd seen this movie before. Would you care to explain what happened here? Tank looked up from his tablet with genuine helpfulness. And GT, Music. And GT, certainly, Commander. We were discussing primitive combat methodologies when Cadet Velta decided to provide a practical music demonstration by kicking me under the desk. I responded by showing the class some examples of human military techniques, educational purposes only, of course. Commander Thexmal's expression suggested he was rapidly developing headache. The Zentorians had been allies of humanity for over 50 years, Music, and they'd learned that when humans started using phrases like educational purposes, property damage usually followed, and these techniques, Music, required hospitalizing 3 of your classmates. Oh, they're not hospitalized, Music, Tank corrected. Velta just had his respiratory system recalibrated. Zeflock experienced some temporary neural disruption, and Kixnara is dealing with harmonic shock. They'll be fine in a few hours, mostly. Professor Hicksmolith had recovered enough of his composure, Music, to attempt reasserting authority. Commander, this human has demonstrated, Music, exactly the kind of primitive behavior that proves my academic thesis. He responded to a minor provocation with overwhelming violence. Tank raised his hand like a student, asking permission to speak. Actually, Professor, I'd argue this demonstrates the effectiveness of human combat. Techniques: 3 opponents 30 seconds. 0 casualties, that's a pretty impressive efficiency ratio for primitive methodology. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Cathar Resh, the Academy's commandant, whose species resembled what might happen if someone crossed an octopus with a university dean. Her 8 arms moved independently as she reviewed multiple data tablets, simultaneously processing information with the kind of multitasking ability that made humans look like single-threaded processors. Cadet Kowalski, she said, her translator, rendering her vocalizations into crisp, administrative tones. This is the 3rd incident involving human cadets this semester. Yes, Tank replied respectfully, though technically the other 2 incidents involved different humans and completely different music circumstances. Admiral Cathar Resh's tentacles writhed in what passed music for exasperation among her species. The pattern suggests that human integration may be more challenging than initially projected. Respectfully, Admiral, Tank said, I think the pattern suggests that other species need to adjust their assumptions about human capabilities. We're not primitive music. We're just direct. One of the Admiral's tentacles gestured toward music, the recovering aliens. You consider this directness? Tank nodded. Music, honestly. Absolutely. Cadet Veltai initiated physical contact to establish dominance. I directly demonstrated why that was a tactical error, very straightforward. Cause and effect. Admiral Cathar Resh spent several minutes reviewing Tank's personnel file. On her tablets, her tentacles moving in complex patterns that suggested deep concentration. Finally, she looked up with what might have been curiosity if octopi could express such emotions. Your file music indicates previous military service with the Terran Marines followed by civilian construction work. It also notes that you scored in the 95th percentile on the Academy's strategic music thinking assessment. Yes, Emu. Yet you chose to resolve this conflict through physical confrontation rather music than diplomatic channels. Tank considered this for a moment. Admiral, with respect, diplomacy assumes both parties are operating in good faith. When someone kicks you under a desk while calling you primitive, they've moved beyond diplomatic solutions. So your response was to prove that point about human primitiveness. No, my response was to prove that point about human effectiveness. Admiral Cathar Resh's tentacles stopped moving entirely, a sign that she was processing something unexpected. Explain. Tank gestured toward his fallen classmate, Professor Hicks Molith's lecture focused on the theoretical obsolescence of physical violence, but theory only matters if it works in practice. These 3 cadets believed their advanced civilizations made them superior to primitive humans. They were wronged. He stood up. And GT, music. And GT, not in a threatening manner but with the confident bearing of someone making an important point. The galaxy keeps calling us primitive while simultaneously asking for our help with their wars. Maybe the problem isn't that we're too primitive, maybe it's that everyone else has forgotten that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is also the most direct one. The lecture hall fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people, having their fundamental assumptions challenged rather than the silence of impending violence. Admiral Cathar Resh's tentacles began moving in slow, thoughtful patterns. Music, are you suggesting that the Academy's approach to military education is flawed? NGT, music. NGT, cadet. I'm suggesting that military education should prepare students for actual military situations. In my experience, actual combat tends to be more music, direct and significantly less theoretical than what we cover in class. Admiral Cathar Resh consulted music, her tablets again, then looked at Professor Hicksmoleth, who was still struggling with the concept that his lecture had been so thoroughly contradicted by practical demonstration. Professor, NGT, music. NGT, in your expert opinion, do Cadet Kowalski's actions constitute a disciplinary violation? The gastropod music, Professor deflated slightly. Technically, he was responding to an initial act of aggression, and his methods, while primitive. NGT, music. NGT, were undeniably effective. Cadet Veltai, who had managed to sit up despite his recent introduction to the floor, spoke with the grudging respect of someone whose worldview had just been forcibly updated. NGT, music. NGT, the human responded appropriately to my provocation. His combat skills are more sophisticated than anticipated. Music. Admiral Cathar Resh turned to Tank with what might have been amusement. It seems, music, Cadet Kowalski, that you've provided your classmates with a more educational experience than our standard curriculum. That wasn't my intention, Admiral. I just wanted to attend class without being kicked. Nevertheless, you've demonstrated that practical application can be more instructive than theoretical discussion. Her tentacles moved in decisive patterns. I'm reassigning you to the combat instruction program, effective immediately. You'll be assisting with practical demonstrations in advanced combat theory classes. Tank blinked in surprise. The Academy has been struggling to provide students with realistic combat experience without actual combat situations. Your directness, music, might prove valuable in bridging that gap. Professor Hicksmoleth made a sound that the translator rendered as academic distress. Admiral, surely we're not going to reward this primitive behavior. Professor, we're going to learn from it. Admiral Cathar Resh's attention shifted back to music. Tank, your first assignment will be revising the combat theory curriculum to include practical human military techniques. I suspect our students' music would benefit from understanding why primitive methods remain effective. 6 months later, Nexus Military Academy's combat training program. Music had undergone what administrators euphemistically called significant philosophical restructuring. Tank's human combat applications course. Music had become the most popular elective in Academy history, with a waiting list that stretched music through 3 academic cycles. The course syllabus promised students practical experience with direct music, conflict resolution methodologies, which was academic speak for learn how humans fight before you accidentally provoke. 1. Tank approached music, his teaching duties with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to his military service, designing exercises that challenged students' assumptions about the relationship between sophistication and effectiveness. Veltai had become Tank's most dedicated student. Music, his previous arrogance, replaced by the focused attention of someone who'd learned that pride and competence were entirely different concepts. The Saurian's natural warrior instincts properly channeled made him an excellent student of human military tactics. His species' combat music techniques combined with human strategic thinking created a hybrid approach that impressed music. Even Tank Katharnaro had discovered that their crystalline physiology, while unsuited for direct combat, made them ideal for analyzing combat patterns and developing tactical assessments. They'd become Tank's unofficial teaching assistant, their harmonic calculations providing precise measurements of force, application, and strategic effectiveness. Zeflock had thrown himself into studying human military history with the obsessive dedication that only insectoids could achieve. His four-armed physiology, combined with human combat techniques, had resulted in a fighting style that was both elegant and terrifying. Tank had started using him as a demonstration partner for advanced classes. Professor Hicksmoleth had initially resisted the curriculum changes, but even he couldn't argue with the results. Students who completed Tank's courses showed marked improvement in tactical thinking, strategic planning, music, and crisis response. More importantly, they'd stopped making assumptions about species capabilities based on technological development levels. The Academy's recruitment materials no longer emphasized civilized species only, though marketing had been careful to avoid explicitly mentioning why. Applications from human candidates had increased by 400%, while applications from other species had remained steady. Apparently, music word had spread through diplomatic channels that the Nexus Academy now offered genuinely practical military education. Tank stood in the same lecture hall where his academic career had taken its violent turn, watching his current class of 37 students from 19 different species work through a tactical problem. Music he designed. The exercise required them to develop strategies for dealing with primitive opponents who relied on direct physical confrontation. Music, a scenario that 6 months ago would have been dismissed as academically irrelevant. Music, his students approached the problem with the kind of serious consideration that came from personal experience with human directness. They'd learned that primitive didn't mean ineffective, and that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was also the most straightforward. Music 1. The irony wasn't lost on Tank that the galaxy's most advanced military academy had needed lessons in practical combat from the species they considered too primitive for admission. But then again, humans had always been good at educational experiences. They just tended to be more hands-on than most species provide. As he watched his students work, Tank reflected on the curious fact that the same qualities that made humans seem primitive to other species, directness, physical capability, willingness to music, use force when necessary, were exactly the qualities that made them effective in situations where sophistication and theory weren't enough. The galaxy had spent centuries developing elaborate philosophical frameworks for avoiding conflict, while humans had spent the same time perfecting techniques for winning conflicts they couldn't avoid. Turns out both approaches had their place in military education, though it had taken some practical demonstration. To make that point clear, Tank smiled as he watched Velter explaining human tactical principles to a group of younger cadets, the former music bully, now teaching others to respect what they didn't understand. Sometimes the best education came from having your assumptions forcibly corrected, even if the correction left you temporarily acquainted with the floor. The really amusing part was that the galaxy's military experts were now studying human combat techniques with the same academic seriousness they'd once reserved for theoretical physics. And GT, music. And GT, primitive species, it turned out, had some rather sophisticated ideas about the practical application of force. Who would have thought that the most advanced military academy in the galaxy could learn something from a bunch of knuckle-dragging primates who solved problems by hitting them until they music stopped moving. Tank certainly hadn't expected it when he'd enrolled as a student, but then again, humans had always been full of educational music surprises.